what happens when we hit the next recession. And the next recession is going to come probably in another year or two. And that means the income levels are going to fall. And so you've got income levels falling, making things worse. You've got higher interest payments making things worse. And households are going to get squeezed from two sides. And since households are effectively the elephant in the economy, household spending comprises 17% of spending in the U.S. economy. If households are being squeezed more and more and more and more, and households have to cut back on their spending because they're being squeezed, then who's going to do the spending in the economy? Certainly not the really, really rich, which is where all of the income has been flowing in the past 10 to 20 years. They've got a lot of income. They're getting more income. They're pretty much saving it. So spending's not going to come from them. The middle class is being squeezed. The poor are being squeezed. They're going to cut back their spending. We're pretty worried. I'm Steve Pressman. I'm professor of economics at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Household debt is the amount of money that households have borrowed and need to repay. The most recent data indicate that households are in debt somewhere around $14 trillion. Most of that $14 trillion, $9 trillion or so, is debt that's due for mortgages. And the rest of the debt are things like cars, college debt, which is growing and becoming a problem, and credit card debt. I think it's not just the bottom end. It's certainly greater at the bottom end since they have less income and less ability to get out of debt, but it also is becoming a problem for the middle class. Middle-income households who experience a slight problem, loss of a job, medical expenses, car repairs that are necessary. They don't have any extra money. There was a recent survey done by the New York Federal Reserve about how many households could come up with $400 if they needed it for an emergency expense. And the answer was just astonishing. 40% of households in the U.S. could not. If you even exclude the top fifth, $150,000 or more, anybody making less than that, chances are 50-50 that you couldn't afford $200. And so what do? You put stuff on your credit card, and then you wind up struggling to have to pay that back due to the high interest rates on the credit card debt. There are problems with measuring income inequality and household debt, and the problems are that these two are kept separate. We have one group, the Federal Reserve, which is responsible for taking surveys and measuring household debt and measuring how much in interest they're paying. And we've got another set of government organizations and government surveys which look at household income, and that's done by the Census Bureau. And so the Census Bureau comes up with figures for things like what's the median income of a household and how many households and what percentage of households in the United States are poor. And they ignore debt and debt issues entirely. The other side is how much debt households are in, and that's just been rising, and it's been rising, and it's been rising since the late 1980s. The other set of data, the income data, the poverty data, is supposed to measure household standard of living. And household standard of living is not just how much money you make, but how much money you have to spend on necessities. And the problem is the interest that you're paying back on the debt that you have can't be used to buy new goods and services because you're using it to pay for old stuff. And so your actual standard of living is much lower because of all of the interest that you're paying. I think the figure is somewhere around $5,000 per household in the United States is now going to pay interest just on household debt. And that figure has been growing and growing and growing and growing. And if you just look at the income figures in the U.S., those figures have been relatively constant since the late 1980s, early 1990s. There have been ups and downs. During good economic times, the figures have gone up a little. During bad economic times, the Great Recession, they've been going down a lot. The last figures that were released in the fall of 2018, 2017 figures, median household income reached a new high. It was $61,000 and change, and that's controlling for inflation. But what it doesn't control for is the households that got into debt during the Great Recession and are still trying to get themselves out of debt. And so they're paying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars of interest each month to try to pay off the debt. That doesn't help their standard of living now. That goes to resolve problems that arose 10 years ago or 5 to 10 years ago when somebody in the family was unemployed. It's the same thing for the middle class as it is for the poor. The middle class is not being sort of measured correctly just because you're not taking into account the fact that the middle class has been shrinking. The middle class has been experiencing downward mobility, and it's hard to deal with the fact that your income is falling because you've got lots and lots of fixed expenses. You can't just get rid of your rent and your mortgage and reduce the amount quickly and easily. It takes time to find another place to live. There are moving expenses, and so you keep going, and in order to survive, what do? You get yourself into debt. And so you may have a quote-unquote middle-class income somewhere between the range that Robert Scott and I have come up with for measuring a middle-class income level, but because you're spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, you don't have a middle-class standard of living. That's, again, the difference between the income figures that the government presents on the one hand and the actual standard of living on the other hand, which involves combining those two data sets. Hyman Minsky is probably the one person responsible for looking at financial speculation, worrying about it, and the financial crisis of 2008 has sometimes been called the Minsky moment, when everybody recognized there was a problem. When Minsky was writing about this in the 1960s, he was writing about firms. And the reason he was writing about firms is in the 1950s and then the 1960s, most households had very, very little debt. Almost all of that debt was mortgage debt. They all had fixed interest rate mortgages, no credit card debt, very little college debt. That's changed considerably. And the institutions or the parts of the economy that were in debt were firms. And so Minsky was concerned with the firms that got themselves into debt and then couldn't repay the debt, because that was the big problem at the time. And Minsky was right to focus on that. There was no reason to focus on households in debt when households were pretty much not in debt. And Minsky defined 3 types of finance for households. One he called hedge finance, and probably the best example of hedge finance is the household that goes out and gets a 30-year mortgage. They can afford it. They pay it back in 30 years, no problem. The second type of finance that Minsky described is speculative finance. And speculative finance occurs when you can pay the interest back on the money that you borrowed, be it a household or a firm, but you can't repay the principal itself. And then finally, Minsky called Ponzi finance that results when you can't even pay the interest on the money that you borrowed. And in the financial crisis, there was a sharp rise of Ponzi finance. And so Minsky focused on firms, and were firms able to pay back the money that they borrowed. Robert Scott and I have realized that household debt is now just as much a problem as the debt of firms, and so we began to look at households and the debt that households have, try to analyze the problems that this creates for the economy, try to understand what the causes are, and also just try to measure what is the financial shape of households. Are households doing better? Are they doing worse? And our results are not really good for the future of the economy. We actually measured and came up with some measures of these 3 things for households to see, could they sustain paying the interest in the short term? Do they have the liquidity? Do you have the $400 question? Also, we looked at whether they might be able to sustain their debt in the longer term because they had the income to be able to sustain paying off that debt over a longer period of time. And then we looked at how much their leverage ratio was, how much debt they had relative to their equity. And we just took fairly standard financial measures of those three things and looked at households and sort of identified households that fell into the hedge, speculative, and Ponzi category on at least two of those three. And we classified those households as either hedge, speculative, or Ponzi households. And the third we thought were just not financially sustainable, just as Ponzi schemes are not financially sustainable. And we went back as far as we could, late 1980s, when the Federal Reserve started doing their surveys of consumer finances and household debt. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it was about 5% of all households that were categorized as being Ponzi households, households that probably should just declare bankruptcy and try to eradicate whatever debt they've got, because there really didn't seem to be any way that they could pay that all off. That figure started rising and rose continuously until the mid-2000s, with one exception, the late 1990s, when things were flat. And things peaked at about 2007, 2008 at somewhere around 14%. So a huge increase in Ponzi households, from 5% of all households in the country to 14% of all households in the country. A lot of that was the mortgage debt that resulted in the Great Recession. Since then, there's been a decline, and the decline has been to somewhere around 10% of households being Ponzi households. But we looked at things a little bit more carefully in our most recent work, and the thing that we noticed was the decline was due not to households paying down debt. They didn't pay down their debt a great deal. Their debt-to-equity ratio improved a little, but not a lot. Some of it improved because households own homes, and the equity in the homes increased starting in around 2010. But the big change was in the first one, how much in interest households were paying on their debt. And remember, if households have $20,000 on average in debt, then a 1% change or a 2% change in interest rates makes a big difference. And it's been even greater than that up until very recently. And the decline in interest rates has been the main factor that's helped households get out of the Ponzi category and move into the speculative category. They can now at least pay the interest on their past debt, not because they're saving more money and paying down their debt, but because the interest payments that are due are actually much lower. And now our concern is the Federal Reserve has already started raising interest rates. And as they start raising interest rates, the debt on credit cards, the debt on college loans, the debt on mortgages are going to start rising. And those households that moved from Ponzi to speculative are going to quickly move back from speculative to Ponzi. And that's only half the problem, we fear. What can be done is the million-dollar question. And Robert, Scott, and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, thinking about this. We have a few simple answers, and the simple answers are answers about, well, we need to provide more government supports for households that are in debt. We need to make bankruptcy a little bit easier. We need to reverse the bankruptcy reforms that took place in the early 2000s during Bush. We also need to provide greater social support, social insurance for households. And another big problem that we've experienced over the past 20 to 30 years as households have incurred more and more debt and households have been squeezed from both sides is that crisis where you don't have that $400 would be helped a lot if social policies were more generous and more liberal. So if unemployment insurance was more generous, a greater percentage of your income, you receive it for longer periods of time. It's easier to get it. You don't have to keep running through rings and loops and things in order to just qualify to get a check. That would make it a little bit easier for households, but that's really just a small part of the problem. The bigger part of the problem is really a problem of income inequality and income distribution. The problem is the lower and middle class households which are experiencing effectively downward mobility. And on the one hand, you've got downward mobility, and on the other hand, you've got fewer safety net protections to help you when things go wrong. Households are just in a bind. And it's not clear what the solution is to that distributional problem. Probably some tax reform would help, raising taxes on the upper income levels to finance tax cuts and greater benefits for people in the middle and lower income levels. But there also needs to be another issue raised, which is how and why are these households getting into debt? And that is really the issue that has not been addressed adequately by economists or finance people or anybody else. And we look at that as it's almost the black box of households. Is money comes in, that's their income, and then money goes out, and that's their spending. And nobody is really talking about what goes on in the household so that the spending that goes out is equal to or greater than the spending that comes in and what's going on in the household. And unfortunately, the economics profession has been abysmal in analyzing this.